Good morning. Welcome to the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario's webinar on the office's new Energy Conservation Report, A Healthy, Happy, Prosperous Ontario, Why We Need More Energy Conservation. My name is Mike Parks. I'm the Energy Policy Manager at the Environmental Commissioner's Office. I'll introduce Commissioner Diane Sachs shortly. Today's webinar will present the highlights from our office's 2019 Energy Conservation Report, which was released earlier this week. Before we hear from Commissioner Sachs, just a few technical details. We expect the presentation will take about 40-45 minutes and followed by some time to respond to questions from the audience. You're invited to submit your questions at any time using the question and answer pane on the GoToWebinar window. If you don't see this question pane, just click on the orange arrow and that should expand the control panel. We'll hold questions until after the Commissioner's presentation and then try to respond to as many as possible in the time we have available. The webinar will also be recorded and will be emailed to all participants shortly after the presentation. The webinar and slides will also be available for viewing at our website, www.eco.on.ca, where you can also download the full report. I'd now like to introduce Commissioner Sachs to present some highlights from our report. Welcome, Commissioner.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on our very last day. As you know, I am Diane Sachs. I have the honor of being your Environmental Commissioner. And we are going to get to slides in just a second. Magic of technology. As you all know, I'm an independent, nonpartisan officer of the legislature. I was unanimously appointed by all MPPs as a guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights. And under that bill, as it is until Monday, I must by law report each year separately on greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario, energy conservation, and environmental protection. And this today, for my last report as your Commissioner, I return to Ontario's successes and failures in conserving energy and energy conservation's essential role in fighting climate change. And as you all know, the Environmental Bill of Rights has just had its 25th anniversary. We celebrated it last month, and it's going to be changed on Monday. So what's in the report? There are 4 main chapters, which are also available in hard copy. And if you would like hard copies, we'll put some contact information up for the Auditor General's office. You can contact them asking for hard copies. You can also download the report today, and we hope that it'll continue to be available on our website for some time to come. The appendices are only available online. They are full of data and background for people who need detail, but the 4 main chapters are, first of all, the basics. Why do we need energy conservation? What are the main advantages, economic advantages, climate advantages, and health and well-being advantages of energy conservation? How to make utility conservation that's funded through electricity and natural gas utilities more effective. The tremendous opportunity that we have to improve the energy efficiency of older homes when they're being renovated anyway, which is surprisingly often. And how urban sprawl leads to not only gridlock, but also enormously high fossil fuel use and air pollution. So starting with chapter 1, the obvious question is, if energy conservation is good for our economy and our environment and health and well-being, why aren't we doing more of it? And the short answer is, without smart public policy, a lot of barriers get in the way. So I mentioned this earlier, it's really, we're cutting off our noses to spite our face by refusing to conserve energy. It's good for the economy, it's good for the climate, it's good for health and well-being. And here's a number of the examples, and many of you have seen this slide before. There's a lot of benefits that we get from reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Now, Ontario has somewhat reduced its energy intensity. As you know, the first year that we were required to report on energy was for the year 2007, and since that time, energy use has stayed about the same, even though population and gross domestic product have both grown. And the result is that per capita, And per dollar of GDP, the energy intensity has gone down. But since we are growing population and GDP fairly quickly, the total amount of energy use hasn't got any better. Lots of reasons for the shift. Some of them are that we have less of some kinds of manufacturing now, for example, pulp and paper. We have much more efficient manufacturing. For example, the iron and steel mills make just as much iron and steel as they ever did, but they're much more efficient at doing that, both with energy and with people. There's also improved efficiency in buildings, in vehicles, in fuels. Homes, for example, are designed to use less energy now than they were before. Our energy intensity is still quite high compared to other developed nations, and as you'll see, we showed particularly in Chapter 2 that we could cost effectively, that is at the same cost or less, reduce our electricity use 31% and our natural gas use by about a quarter in the next 20 years at the same cost or less. So by saving money, or at least not spending any more, we could use dramatically less energy, and particularly fossil fuels. 3/4 of Ontario's energy comes from fossil fuels. It still amazes me how many people think that energy and electricity are the same. They're not. As you can see from this lovely pie chart, called in French a camembert, electricity is the smallest and cleanest of our energy sources. We only get about 23% of our energy from electricity, and all the rest, almost all the rest, except for a small amount of wood, is fossil fueled. And so when we talk about energy conservation, again, people tend to think that we're only talking about making kids turn the lights off, or changing light bulbs, or closing the fridge door, which are all about electricity. Electricity conservation is important, it remains important, but if we think only about electricity conservation, we're missing 75 to 80% of the problem and the opportunities. And so we look at that more broadly in this report. From an economic point of view, the first thing that we always look at is how much does it cost Ontario to rely for 75% of our energy on fossil fuels? And the short answer is that Ontario spent $16.8 to about $25 billion a year in the most recent data that we have just to import fossil fuels. And that's money that drains out of the province every single year, doesn't create employment here, doesn't leave any lasting benefits, and then we have to do it again the next year. And it's driven primarily by the price of crude oil and the value of the Canadian dollar, which, as you know, go up and down. So we have no control over it. If we were 10% more efficient, we'd keep an extra $1.5 to $2 or $2.5 billion in the province every year. Anybody think of something good we might be able to do with that? And we know that we could easily be 10% more efficient. As I've just shown you, cost effectively, we could be close to 30% more efficient and save money, or at least not spend any more at the same time. And then we would spend a lot less importing fossil fuels. So we know there's lots of evidence that energy efficiency is good for the economy. It's a net creator of jobs, it fuels GDP growth, it helps lower home energy bills, makes homes more comfortable to live in. It can help businesses and the public sector reduce overhead. And in our very first energy report, we showed that the broader public sector could be saving about $450 million every single year if their buildings were more efficient. And as well, we'd have stimulating our homegrown businesses. We really have done very well in Ontario until last year, growing an efficiency and clean tech sector that was really outstanding, both in Canada and around the world. And if we continue to support those folks, we can keep having those jobs and innovation here. Now it's, let's see if I can get closer to the computer here. It's critical to our climate goals as well that we become more efficient in our use of energy, particularly fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency has reported over and over that energy efficiency could achieve about 40% of the needed greenhouse gas reductions to help meet the Paris Agreement targets. And if we meet the Paris Agreement targets, many of the worst consequences of climate change may not happen. Ontario, as you all know, recently substantially weakened our greenhouse gas reduction targets. But whatever our target is, energy efficiency is one of the best ways to get there. It won't get us the whole way for sure, but it can get us a lot of the way. And it's the only source of energy with no negative environmental impacts. And that's very important. As we showed in our electricity report last year, how many adverse environmental impacts there are from every form of electricity generation, renewable, nuclear, doesn't matter what. But not energy efficiency. And then, of course, there's air pollution and health. Fossil fuel burning at the very same time that it creates a big import bill and serious climate pollution, it also creates air pollution that is one of the biggest threats to public health, and particularly for people who live close to big roads or spend a lot of time commuting on big roads, or who work or go to school or kindergarten near big roads. And if you look at the statistics, it's really amazing. So you can see about a quarter of the population lives close to major roads and highways, and traffic pollution is quite localized. The closer you are to the road, the worse the pollution is. And if you're sitting on that road for an hour or two a day, you are right in the middle of the worst air pollution we've got. If you go to kindergarten on a major road, you're right in some of the worst air pollution you got. And you can see about a quarter of our elementary schools are there. And if you look at where do we put our seniors, who generally are very vulnerable, half of those facilities are very close to major roads where the worst air pollution is. So we're taking vulnerable people and putting them in situations where they are exposed to the worst air pollution we create in most areas, and it's entirely avoidable. We have the technology not to do this, but we keep doing it. So so what are these barriers that I'm talking about, and why do they need government action? Well, there's three kinds of barriers to energy conservation. First of all, there's a group of opportunities. This graph isn't really to scale, but there's a significant group of opportunities that already save money. People would already save money if they changed their light bulbs to LEDs. This has been documented for years, and yet it's astonishing how many people keep buying and keep using inefficient light bulbs. So that's just one of many examples where even though something already would save money and make the climate better and reduce air pollution, people keep doing the wrong thing. And sometimes it's habit, sometimes it's just familiarity, sometimes it's lack of information, sometimes it's because we in Ontario have refused to provide home energy audit disclosure at the time of sale, which we've talked about now for 10 years. Sometimes it's because although something would save money over a few years, people don't have the upfront cash, they need access to financing. So there are a number of things that we could do very easily so that cost-effective conservation starts to happen. And as I've already shown you, cost-effective conservation could reduce our energy use by about 30%. Then there's a lot of conservation that gets blocked, even though it makes economic sense, because the costs and benefits aren't well aligned. Classic example of this is a residential apartment building where the landlord pays for capital costs, but the tenant pays all the energy costs. So does the landlord care if the tenant's energy costs are going through the roof? Answer, no. And even if the landlord cares, it doesn't make any financial sense for them to put in the money to improve the building if the tenant gets all the benefits and the landlord doesn't get the money back. So we have a very large number of rental buildings which just don't get improved. And that's a structural barrier. It's easily resolved. We know how to do it. And so that's one of the things we look at as well. And finally, we have a lot of opportunities to have good lives with less energy use that are not practical for individuals because of government decisions, mostly on infrastructure and land use planning. So that many people would like to choose to live close to work and walk or cycle, or maybe take the TTC, but where they live, and most Ontarians live where they can't do those things. Well, that's not because those people choose badly. That's because of government decisions that have put them in a position where they can't choose the better options, and that requires different government decisions. So we look at these barriers in the next few chapters. So chapters 2, 3, and 4. 2 is all about conservation programs for electricity and natural gas. This is the area that people often think of in terms of what is energy conservation. The third one is about older homes and the opportunity to get energy efficiency in the project when renovation is happening anyway. The fourth chapter is about land use planning and municipal growth. And the overall recommendation is we're not going to be able to save the billions of dollars that we can by reducing our fossil fuel use unless the government makes this a priority and a target and gets to work on it. Because we don't have any target for this, and we don't have any effective government programs, and we're not on track to do it. So, starting with Chapter 2, making utility conservation more effective. So, I hope you all know we do have utility conservation programs, and we've had them for about a decade, and they've worked really well. So, we're talking here about electricity and natural gas. So, you can see from this lovely pie chart again, the yellow, the upper left-hand corner, that's electricity. So it's the smallest of our major energy sources. And natural gas is the second largest. It's used mostly for heating. And we've had 10 years since the Green Energy Act in 2009 with really significant utility conservation programs. So these are conservation programs that ratepayers have paid for through their bills, that the utility companies have used the money to provide various conservation programs. And as you all know, last week there were severe cuts to the electricity conservation programs, and I'll be glad to answer questions about that if you'd like. Obviously, that's not in the report because it had to go to print before that announcement. But has utility conservation worked? Has it been a good use of money? Absolutely, it's been a good use of money. And you can see that it's reduced overall electricity consumption about 7% compared to where it otherwise would have been. And peak demand, even better, down 10%. And peak demand is, as I hope you all know, it's what really counts. It costs the most to meet. It puts the greatest strain on our system. And it is by far the biggest economic, environmental strain on our electrical grid, and it's going to be the hardest going forward. And same thing in natural gas. We've had really significant savings in natural gas consumption, would have been about 7% higher, even though the amount spent on conserving natural gas has been a small portion, less than a quarter of what's been spent on electricity conservation over the last decade. So now what? Well, the government, this is the famous waterfall graph from the government's environment plan in November. And they say absolutely nothing about electricity conservation in that plan, which is of great concern to us. But they do have this chart where they say that natural gas conservation, and on one of their other charts, they say it's going to be that they're going to get 18 megatons of reductions by 2030, and 18% of that they say is going to come from additional natural gas conservation on top of what's happening already. So I multiply 18 by 18 and I get 3.4, but the government tells us that actually what they mean by that is 3.2 megatons of climate pollution reductions they're going to get from expanding natural gas conservation, presumably to be paid for by natural gas customers. So we looked at that. We said, all right, can you really get 3.2 megatons of carbon dioxide reductions from utility conservation? I mean, 3.2 megatons isn't really very much. It's a tiny fraction of what we need to do. We had, a year ago, we had a target to reduce our climate emissions by about 45 megatons by then, and we really need to do something like that. 3.2 is really tiny. But anyway, the question is, can utility conservation do what the government says it's going to do? So we looked first at the government's rationale, and to put it mildly, we weren't impressed. They drew this number from a study by the Ontario Energy Board that said, in essence, if money is of no object, if you don't care what anything costs, then by putting no limit on how much you increase the natural gas company's conservation budget, you could get this extra 3.2 megatons by 2030. The government doesn't actually say anywhere that they will allow the gas companies to spend any amount of money on conservation, and nor do we think that conservation, regardless of cost, is the right approach. So we weren't very impressed with the government's rationale. But the good news is that based on our review, together, if we have good electricity conservation and good natural gas conservation, cost effectively, we can get 3.2 megatons of cost-effective reductions by 2030. And after all, 3.2 megatons isn't really very much. But we won't get this net benefit without electricity conservation. And so it's really of serious concern to us that the government has trashed the conservation framework we have now. They've said nothing about any kind of conservation after 2020. They've made a serious cut in the funding for conservation even from now to 2020. That's next year. So in the middle of all these programs, they've been cut. And from our review and the available evidence from the government and from the independent electrical system operator, if they cancel electricity conservation, then we're going to get more fossil fuels used to generate electricity, and so emissions from that are going to go up another 2 megatons, and that will offset most of what the government says it could get through spending an unlimited amount of money on natural gas conservation. So that seems rather silly. We do agree that electricity conservation needed to be improved, and we have reported several times, and we report again, electricity conservation should be focused when it matters. The framework that the government trashed provided incentive payments to the local distribution companies for reducing electricity consumption no matter when it happens. And that's silly because the benefits both economically to the grid and environmentally, including from a climate and air pollution point of view, don't come all the time. About 2/3 of the time, all our electricity is nuclear or renewable. There's no climate benefit to that, and there's basically no economic benefit at that point. Big benefits come from reducing peak consumption. And so electricity conservation, we need it, we have to have it, but we need it focused at peak, and we might see more of that. So why do we need it at peak and not the rest of the time? Well, we've tried different graphs over the years. Those of you who've been faithful participants in our webinars, thank you, you've seen various graphs. So here's a new graph trying to explain this again. And what we show here is a visual demonstration again, how much Ontario electricity demand varies. So a lot of people think we have surplus electricity, we're giving it cheap to the US, we don't need conservation, we have too much anyway. And that's only true some of the time. So some of the time, we don't use very much electricity in Ontario when it's not very hot outside and it's not very cold outside and most businesses are closed. So spring, fall, mild weather, especially weekends and nights, we don't use a lot of electricity. And at those times, the nuclear plants are still pumping out an enormous amount of electricity and the sun still shines and the water still flows. So we do have extra electricity then, and we make about $250 million a year selling that to the US. But the reason we have built so much electricity capacity is not for the mild days when we don't need much electricity. We've built all that electricity capacity because on a hot summer weekday, we need twice as much energy. And you can see even on a hot summer day from 4 in the morning to 6 in the afternoon, the demand can increase 60%. So on those really hot afternoons, we use all the capacity that we have. And in fact, I think I've got a slide to show you that. So the independent electrical system operator has already shown us that we're going to be short capacity at those peak demand times in just 4 years, 2023. So this is a new chart issued right after the government canceled the 752 clean energy contracts, which we're going to provide us with a substantial amount of additional peak. And we don't have that now, that the Pickering plants are still going to close. And as you can see, at that point, we have a gap. In our electricity report last year, we pointed out there's a lot of ways of dealing with that gap, including using pricing to have demand follow supply rather than the other way around, more conservation, more storage. But instead, the government says they're going to be using a capacity auction, which means probably buying an awful lot of gas-fired electricity because it's cheap to build and doesn't need long-term contracts. And so we're going to see fossil fuel use in electricity go back up again, I expect. So what does conservation do at peak times? It helps keep the lights on by dealing with the capacity issue. It helps keep the costs down because at peak times, the cheapest way is conservation. And in fact, one of the great pieces of news that we report on is the costs of conservation have come down substantially. The conservation programs that the local utilities have been operating they've got more efficient, they've got better at it. Starting new programs is always hard. Once you get better at it, they get better, and the costs came down dramatically, but those things have all just been canceled. So now we've got a new group going to be starting with new things and whatever. A third thing we have to look at is getting beyond the silos. One of the real problems we have in energy policy, and in fact many areas of government policy that we've been privileged to witness, is how often the solutions come across silos rather than within them. And that's what we don't have. When electricity companies run electricity programs and natural gas companies run natural gas programs, anything outside the silo gets forgotten. So people who heat with oil or propane, they're left out. People who heat with wood, they're left out. Somebody who's got electricity and natural gas in their house, they've got to go to 2 different utilities. If they wanted to get some help on an audit, they got to do it twice. It's all inefficient and confusing. If we want to have the best opportunities, we need to be able to look at different energy sources together, and it'll also bring the costs down. So we look at how the government could get beyond the silos. And also, 2020 is next year. It takes time to build things. We really need to if we've thrown out all the work that's been done up until now, we need to start discussions now about what are we going to do that's sensible after 2020. We can't just sort of hope magically that something's going to happen, because it doesn't work like that. So we've gotten a number of recommendations. Bottom line, government wants 3.2 megatons of reductions from conservation. They can have it, but they have to do it sensibly. And that means keeping electricity conservation, but focusing it, growing the natural gas conservation, including other kinds of houses anyway, focusing on peak and so on. Yes, please do remember, if you have any questions, send them in, and hopefully we'll know the answers. Chapter 3 is about older homes. So again, must older homes be drafty energy hogs? Not if we improve their energy during renovations. And this is a tremendously important opportunity. We have an awful lot of energy that goes to use just heating homes. As you can see, about $2,391 per family spending on energy. But why homes in particular? So by homes, we're referring to low-rise residential buildings. In this chapter, there's lots of other buildings that also need efficiency, but in this chapter, we started by looking at homes. And why? Because 83% of residential energy is in these low-rise single or single-attached buildings, and most Ontarians live in those kinds of homes. And they really are remarkably inefficient. I know, I live in one. But if you think about a house built, like almost all the houses in Ontario, almost all the homes in Ontario were built before 2005. And a house built even as recently as 2005, which honestly is not that long ago, it was designed to use twice as much energy per square meter as a house that's built today. And the older ones than that are even worse. So they keep on going year after year using this huge amount of energy. They leak heat all over the place, and they're not becoming more efficient. We've had a decade of conservation programs, and they just haven't got really much better, even though people remarkably love to renovate their houses, which is astonishing. But they don't often pay any attention to the building envelope. And if we want more than 30% reductions in energy use in houses, and we really do, we ought to pay attention to the envelope. One of the metaphors we use in the report is, if you're going to go outside in a really cold weather, somebody think about one of the really cold days we had this winter. If you went outside in a thin little coat with holes in it, how warm were you? Well, not very. Well, that's what most of these houses are like. They leak heat. They've got very poor insulation. You could go outside with a really warm hat, coat, mitts, and you'd be comfortable no matter that temperature. Well, the same kind of thing. You can make a house comfortable in very cold conditions with limited energy, and Sweden's way ahead of us on this, but we haven't done it. So there's lots of benefits to including energy efficiency by looking at the envelope during renovation, and there's a whole batch of examples, and it would also save money. If you have to buy a new furnace for a leaky house, you have to spend an awful lot of money in that furnace because it has to be big. If you put in solar panels to try to heat a leaky building, you need an awful lot of solar panels. It costs a fortune. If you make the building much more efficient first, now you're spending much less on your heating and cooling equipment. And so that's why it's so frustrating that these conservation programs, and I told you they were successful, they've done a lot of good, but they have almost entirely missed a building envelope for a decade. And the only funding that really was making a difference was the funding that was coming from cap and trade, which in some cases was really targeted at building envelopes. And as you all know, we don't have that anymore. Now, homeowners say they want energy efficiency. A lot of homeowners recognize they'd like to be more efficient. They'd like to spend less on their power bills. They'd like to have fewer drafts. They'd like to be more comfortable. But why don't they get it? Well, because they think that doing anything about the building is going to be too expensive and too disrupted, and besides, nobody could see it. And do you really need it anyway? Lots of people have no idea. As long as it keeps the rain out, they think the building envelope is doing its job, and very often it isn't. So about almost half of Ontarians are planning to renovate in the next year. This is amazing, spending about $13,000 or more than $13,000 every time. So there's a huge renovation industry in Ontario and a huge opportunity. And if you do your energy upgrades when you're already renovating, it costs much less, it's much less disruptive. You're already doing a lot of the work. You've already got the guys with the dirty boots in your house. It's a much simpler time to do it. So why don't people do it? Well, we've looked at the obstacles, and there's really 4 of them. And the number one and the easiest to deal with, but the most important, is people don't know that their house is so inefficient. They don't realize that they're paying much more than they need to heat the house. They don't realize how easy it would be to make it better. And so the first thing is disclosure. People really need to know how what their building is consuming, what it could be consuming, how they compare to their neighbors. And that's critically home energy audit disclosure at the time of purchase, which we have had available in the law for a decade. It's just been repealed and we never used. The second thing is access to financing. So the thing about energy efficiency, it saves you a lot of money in your operating costs, but you have to pay for it up front. And so for a lot of people, that's a challenge. And it needs to be financed. It's a good bet for financing companies because it pays back. People do have to heat. Winter's going to come every year, whether we like it or not. And so there are lots of financial institutions interested in financing, but there hasn't been a link to make that work between individuals who'd like the money, the financing, and the institutions who'd like to offer it. Then there's a question of standards. We really should have a building code type of approach for retrofits. Right now, the building code simply says, if you tear something out in your building, you have to put it back and it has to be no worse. Well, that's something, but it could be so much better. The things that really obviously make financial sense, they should be mandatory. That would make them less costly. You'd have economies of scale. It would just be built automatically into the renovation costs. And then there's the question of capacity. So the renovation industry needs to know how to do this. They need to have access to the skilled trades. And this is something that would help build up skilled workforce in Ontario and more jobs for contractors. And we know that renovations create a lot of local jobs that can't be offshored. There's currently over 175,000 jobs in home renovation, but to have even 2% of homes getting envelope improvements each year, which is what we would need to have any kind of significant reduction of building energy use over the next 20 years. That would be as many jobs as in building houses. It would mean as many projects as the houses that are now built every year in Ontario. So huge opportunity for skilled trades, for jobs, for making everybody's life better. Ontario homes don't need to be energy hawks, but we have to bring in energy efficiency when we're renovating anyway. So that's our recommendations. People have to know the efficiency. They have to be easy to finance. The building code has to do its job. And the renovation professionals have to have the capacity and expertise, which they absolutely could have. And finally, the question about urban sprawl. So we, again, have so many benefits from paying attention to reducing the use of fossil fuels for transportation. We can save energy, shorten commutes, improve air quality, improve the quality of life, and it's driven by land use. And as I said in my remarks to the legislature, which are available on the website if you like, the press conference is all on the webinar. Land use really is Ontario's oil sands, economically, politically, in terms of driving our emissions, in terms of determining our future. And that's a question of land use. We have to talk about cars. So fossil fuel transportation, particularly personal cars, are 1/5 of Ontario's emissions. Car travel is growing faster than population. Transportation fuel is the fastest growing of our energy sources. 4 out of 5 Ontarians commute by car, and Ontario car emissions, according to the International Energy Agency, are the world's worst. We have the least efficient vehicles, and we drive them the most. So we are now #1, the worst in the world. Congratulations. So Ontarians are driving more than ever. So since 1990 and since 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted, and we all knew that fossil fuel use dramatically has to be slashed in order to have any kind of sustainable future. And look what we've done with our use of fossil fuels. This is almost all gasoline and diesel. So not only has our population gone up, but per capita driving has also gone up. So why do we drive so much? Is it that we just, have an unusual love affair with our cars? Is it that our roads are so wonderful? No. It's mostly because of land use. It's mostly because of where we live. 3 out of 4 Ontarians live in car-dependent suburbs where that's really the only option that they've got. And why do they live there? Because that's what government policy is designed to produce. So we get a lot of media headlines about high-rises. We get a lot of complaints about high-rises. And we do have high-rises in some downtown areas. We have a lot of high-rises, but that is not where the growth is. Almost all population growth is occurring in suburbs that are being built on what used to be, not very long ago, either places that grew our food or the forests and wetlands that we need, not just for species, but to protect us from floods and droughts. Car-dependent suburbs grew 5 times faster than the kinds of areas that we should be building in the last 20 years. And urban sprawl has very high costs. Got economic costs, social costs, environmental costs, climate costs. One of the things we often hear people, suburbanites, complaining about is, why are their property taxes so high? And they feel, I've heard really bitter complaints about this. Well, here's one of the reasons. It costs the municipalities more than twice as much, almost 3 times as much, to have a family in the suburb as it does downtown, as well as the fact that a lot of the downtown infrastructure is already built. Plus, as we build more and more and more new subdivisions, more and more new infrastructure has to be built, and municipalities are on a treadmill that they never catch up on. Because of the way that they are financed, their only sources of money really are property tax, very, very politically difficult to raise, and development charges. So development charges are tremendously attractive, and they get a big chunk of development money when they allow a new subdivision, but it's never enough to pay for the services that subdivision ends up creating demand for. So they have to get another suburb to help pay the money to operate all the suburbs they've got already, and they never catch up. It gets worse and worse, and we'll see that it's actually going to get quite a bit worse going forward. So huge economic problems, huge environmental problems, very hard on people spending so many hours in traffic. And one of the amazing things that I learned preparing this report is that we, around the Greater Toronto area, we have about the worst commute in North America. The average GTA resident spends 8 hours commuting a week, more than Los Angeles, more than New York City, more than most other big cities. It's about the worst there is. And the good news is it's about to get a lot worse. I mean, it's not the good news. The news is it's going to get a lot worse because we are undergoing extraordinary population increase. In the next couple of decades, we're expecting the population of the Greater Golden Horseshoe to be nearly 40% larger than it is now. And congestion already costs the economy about $11 billion a year. And the way the growth plan works, we're going to have huge numbers of people who will have no alternative to drive, at least another 1 million people who will have no alternative but to pour onto the existing roads driving their individual car. And we know that driving is incredibly energy inefficient. And you can see here how much more fossil fuels you use driving a car than taking public transit or cycling. Recognizing, again, lots of people, because of where the houses have been built and how far they are from jobs, don't have a choice. Those who have choices, here's the numbers. But even for those who have to drive, this 80% of the population who live in places where there's almost no alternative, there are options. And so we have a brand new fact sheet that we put out just yesterday. Do get it. It's on our blog, on the impact of individual choices. And for people who have to long commutes and therefore really big carbon footprints from commuting, your choices really matter. If you're able to carpool, you're cutting your footprint in half. If you can move from a truck to a much more efficient turbocharged little gasoline car, you save a lot of emissions. If you're able to have an electric car, even better. If you're able to work from home some of the time, again, better. Also makes you more sane. And the dog likes it. So there's many more opportunities that everybody has, but the first thing is the land use. So living in a suburban area means a really big carbon footprint. It means you're using much more energy than other people to heat your home because it's standing out by itself. It doesn't get sheltered by its neighbors. You're using enormously more energy for every kind of transportation, using much more energy for what gets shipped to your house, everything you do. So as you can see, there's a huge difference in your energy footprint depending on where you live. So are there any solutions? Of course there are solutions, and these have been well established for a long period of time. And the short answer is you grow in, not out. And again, the good news is it doesn't have to mean living in a high-rise. We have lots of room in existing municipalities for let's call the missing middle. Townhouses, stacked townhouses, maybe 5-story buildings that can accommodate lots and lots of people at reasonable costs, close to transit, close to jobs. Mississauga alone, they've got these giant parking lots around their transit nodes, which means there's almost nobody within walking distance of the transit. And there's a housing shortage, which pushes the prices up. With 5% of their land that's around their housing nodes, they've got room for nearly 500,000 more people who could have good communities near jobs, near transit, near services, near stores, and wouldn't have to be driving all the time. And that's just Mississauga. So why isn't this happening in the Greater Golden Horseshoe? Well, we know this is where the need is. This is where the growth is. There's lots of places around Ontario that is not experiencing significant growth, in fact, are stagnating or losing population. But if you think about the Greater Golden Horseshoe, well, we're expecting this nearly 4 million more people. And well, where are they going to be? So for planning purposes, the growth plan describes what they call an inner ring, which is that sort of light green on the map, and what they call the outer ring, which is that pale brown. And you can see that's beyond the green belt. That means a lot of people having to drive across the green belt every day. And the growth plan, this is provincial rules that set the planning framework for the region. Now, it's got lots of nice green words in it. If you just read the front end of the plan, it sounds great. It says all kinds of wonderful things, which are really well documented in planning evidence. How we're going to increase densities and reduce sprawl and have compact communities and great qualities of life and alternatives to cars. And it doesn't work. It has completely failed to work. And there's a lot of reasons for that are built in to the plan. The first is really completely inexplicable to us. So there are 2 government ministries paid for with all of our taxes who look at where is population growth going to occur. So the first is the Ministry of Finance. And the Ministry of Finance has done a detailed study of where population growth is likely to occur, and that's presumably if the government doesn't do anything. And there's a lot of sprawl in that. But then we look at, what does the growth plan say? So you'd hope that the growth plan would say, we're not going to have as much sprawl as would happen by itself. Let's have less sprawl. But guess what? The population allocations in the plan, this is the part that bites. This is the part that forces municipalities to set aside land and plan and build infrastructure. It forces much more sprawl than the Ministry of Finance says would happen anyway, which is sort of nuts. The growth plan already says that 1 million people have to be accommodated in these outer ring municipalities at very low densities. They're going to be too low for transit, and they're going to be a long way from jobs, because one of the things we do know in the growth plan is they've got growth forecasts that are way off. They bear no resemblance whatsoever to where job growth is occurring. So they have this rosy idea that there's going to be growth scattered all around somewhere near these suburbs, but that's not, in fact, what's happening. Most of the growth is occurring in job growth in downtown Toronto and in a very small number of specific areas, such as around the airport. The growth plan has the wrong numbers in terms of what growth is going to actually be. Sorry, and the combination of this is they're going to force 1 million people to be accommodated in these outer rings, long ways from jobs, no transit. They're not going to have any choice but to drive. How good is your commute going to be with another 1 million people trying to get on those same roads? Plus, of course, the growth plan itself has been very poorly implemented. So all that lovely words in the plan about increasing densities and not having sprawl, it's not happening on the ground. The government has not enforced it. The municipalities have not followed it. So most recent growth is not occurring close to frequent transit. Most municipalities aren't, or many of them are not meeting the minimum targets. The government has done really no effective job of oversight or reporting. And the bottom line is, in 2003, the whole reason we have the growth plan is studies in 2003 said, oh my God, we're on track to have this enormous amount of sprawl, more than 1,000 square kilometers of precious farmland, irreplaceable forests and wetlands turned into suburbs. How much difference has the growth plan made? We now have more than that, or on track for. So the proposed amendment that the government is now planning, the growth plan, amazingly enough, is actually going to make it even worse. There were some improvements to the growth plan in 2017 that were just starting to bite, and so the government's taking those away, weakening the targets, making it easier for municipalities to expand their boundaries and force their neighbors to turn over land that can be made into suburbs, reduced opportunities for public opposition. They've taken climate change and net zero concepts out so that the municipalities have to ignore, or at least aren't allowed to look at climate change officially as a rationale for their planning. This is all pretty nuts. So we know this puts us on the road to gridlock. Now, some people think, well, okay, we'll just build more roads. And the one thing we really do know at this point is lots and lots and lots of evidence, not just from Ontario, but around the world, that you cannot build your way out of congestion. If you build the land use wrong, you cannot fix it by building more roads. You can build all the roads you like, and you still get the same amount of congestion. And if by any miracle you have extra space on the road, traffic rapidly increases and fills it in again. And we reported on some of that last year's climate report. So obviously we think this is nuts. We are taking irreplaceable resources and deliberately building ourselves into a future that is going to be terrible for the people living in those suburbs and for anybody else trying to get around. And we have well-known, well-documented solutions based on ample evidence and good practices. What do we have to do? The first thing is make it possible, convenient to build higher densities right near transit and jobs. Make it possible to build the missing middle. There's lots of developers willing to do it if they were allowed to just go ahead and build these things without enormous obstacles. We need the growth plan to actually do what it says. Instead of forcing growth out into sprawl areas, it should really prevent sprawl and bring growth into the areas that have transit and jobs. Require municipalities to put those areas that are right around transit stations and zone them for higher densities before they get more provincial funding. Reverse these amendments that weaken the plan, and report to the public. If there aren't targets and regular credible measurements, there isn't any accountability. And so the loss of our office is going to have to be somebody else doing that. So having said that, yeah, this is our last day. As you all know, the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario, our office, is being abolished on Monday. So today is our last day. We run from this webinar to packing up our offices. My computer is being wiped as we speak. And so it's, it's the end of 25 years of really outstanding service to the people of Ontario. Yeah. So my staff are encouraging me. It's not just an end, it's a new beginning. And I've got some great people who are looking for jobs. You should definitely hire them. Some of my other people are going to be at the Auditor General's office and doing their absolute best there. I do want to thank my staff and the external reviewers for helping us deliver this really excellent report under extraordinarily difficult conditions. The uncertainty, the cruelty with which the staff have been treated in the last 4 months is just really offensive. And nevertheless, people put their game face on, came to work every day, and have worked their butts off to do another really wonderful report, plus the new fact sheet yesterday, which is based on a truly stunning amount of life cycle analysis. It's not available anywhere else for Ontario data. Hard copies of our reports may still be available from the Auditor General's office. We'll give you contact information in a second. Our website is going to survive for a while. We don't know how long. We're not aware of any current plans to take it down. I still encourage you to download stuff now because there's 25 years of great material on that website that I think you'll really find useful. But mostly I want to say thank you. And thank you for joining us today and for really all the help that we have received from so many of you on so many topics. I know many of you I've called up at one point or another and say, I don't have any money, but I need help. I need information, and really you've all been extraordinarily supportive. So with that, this is how you reach the Auditor General's office, and I hope you get what you need from them. But for now, you will also be able to get in touch with Mike. Mike is going to be at the Auditor General's office, but at least for now, his ECO email address will continue to work. And you'll also be able to find me. I'm starting a new business starting Monday called Sachs Facts, giving public talks and strategic advice, focusing on climate. And my contact information will be on LinkedIn and on Twitter, and hopefully Googleable sometime next week. So, but thank you very much. And I hope somebody has some questions about our report. So look at that, there are questions.
Yes, yeah. Thanks very much, Commissioner. We've got a number of questions coming in already. We'll encourage you to submit any more questions that you have. Just as a reminder, you can submit those questions using the question and answer pane on the GoToWebinar window, and use the orange arrow to expand the control panel if you don't see that option there. So our first question relates to carbon pricing. I'm presuming this is in relation to the federal carbon price. The question being, what is your opinion on the new price of carbon, and how do you think that it will affect energy efficiency?
Well, as I reported in my climate report, I think the cap and trade was better for Ontarians than the federal carbon price. But the federal carbon price is a lot better than nothing. If it survives the election this fall, I think it really will be helpful. The reason that the Nobel Prize for Economics was given to William Nordhaus in September, right after Ontario abandoned pricing carbon, is because he proved that pricing carbon is the best way for the economy. We can get emission reductions through regulation, absolutely, but it's more expensive. So if we want to have the climate results that we must have for our survival at the lowest economic cost, pricing carbon does that. The reason we have money is as a means of exchange between things that aren't otherwise exchangeable or commensurable. And so pricing carbon works. I'm glad we have a federal carbon tax starting on Monday. It does provide, again, a economic incentive for reducing energy. It will be much harder for some people because under the cap and trade system, not only did we have the price, but we also had the money being reinvested. So a small business, for example, had better access to grants to help pay for the cost of the energy efficiency that they need than they will have under the federal system. Nevertheless, any price on carbon is better than no price on carbon. And as a if the program survives, as the price rises, there will be more money available to feed back to help people invest in the changes that they need.
Thanks very much, Commissioner. Next question. Close your eyes. This relates to a specific slide, so I'm just going to flip back. We go back a few slides here. So this slide speaks of collaboration between electricity and natural gas conservation programs. And the question is, what do you think about water reduction and water conservation programs? Can we maximize water conservation, which also has an impact on electricity use at the same time?
Right, absolutely. So thank you for that question. And as I hope you all know, we reported on the link between water and energy in our Every Drop Counts report 2 years ago, which is still an absolutely relevant and excellent report, and I hope you look at it. You're absolutely right. Water conservation has significant energy footprint as well as other environmental benefits. We didn't look at it specifically here. You are right that for a customer, once you have an efficiency audit going on, there's very little additional cost and a lot of benefit to also looking at water. And that does make some good sense. I know that, for example, London Hydro and some of their programs that have just been canceled, they were providing assistance that did look at water as well as energy when they went into a building. And that makes particular sense also for low-income people, where every dollar spent on utilities is taken away from something else. And so if you're going into a home to evaluate energy conservation, it would make sense to do that as well. But we didn't specifically look at it in this report.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Next question relating to some of the material on Chapter 3 on home retrofits. What are your comments on the implementation of local improvement charges as a possible means to raise capital for energy efficiency improvements for both homes and businesses?
Well, local improvement charges are obviously a very sensible way of doing it. It provides exactly that question about access to upfront capital in a way that is securely paid back over time because it's attached to the property taxes. And that has another advantage, which is that Ontarians move a lot. And people are sometimes reluctant to invest in energy efficiency that has a 5-year payback if they think they're going to move in 3 years. Whereas if you finance something over a local improvement charge, it means that the cost is basically paid out of the savings over the whole 5 years. And if the person moves after 3 years, they've got their savings, and then the next person picks it up. The challenge with local improvement funding is that banks are nervous about having anything that's prior to their mortgage, and because they have an unfettered right to object to it right now, they often do object. So we pointed out that's an obstacle, and I don't think they should be able to object to funding that improves the building. It's going to improve its resale value, and for social reasons as well. Local improvement charges for energy efficiency should be able to go ahead of the mortgage, in my view. Maybe up to some kind of maximum percentage of the value of the building so that the mortgage security isn't weakened.
Thanks, Commissioner. So you spoke earlier about the large bill Ontario has for fossil fuel imports. So we had a question of how much of those fossil fuel imports are coming from other provinces versus international imports.
Well, it changes with time. Most of our oil in Ontario is coming from Western Canada. But in terms of natural gas is increasingly coming from fracking in the US. And as you know, fracking has a very high climate footprint because of the leak ratio. And natural gas, when the leak ratio is over about 3%, has a very big climate footprint, isn't necessarily better than coal. And there's a lot of evidence that in the fracking areas, it is higher than 3%. So that is an increasing concern.
Okay, thank you. Next question, what about using energy storage for peak demand reduction? We can decrease our electricity production with renewables and use energy storage solutions. Can that help address our deficit for meeting peak demand?
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think I mentioned this earlier, in Making Connections, which was our electricity report last April, which I strongly commend to you. We looked hard at how to meet the peak demand without just building more and more gas plants. And the storage is one of the big pieces, using more sensible pricing. We should give people a bigger economic incentive to use electricity at night when we have lots of it going begging instead of at peak. And right now we don't. So storage is part, conservation is part, pricing is part, and we've got that extensively analyzed in last year's report.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. A couple quick factual questions. Why does the pie chart that shows the Ontario's energy use by type of fuel, why does that show electricity as fossil fuel free?
All right, so close your eyes. We're going to
Close
go
your
back to
eyes
that
again,
one.
yeah.
If you don't like seeing scrolling, which I don't.
Almost there. There we are.
Right. So because most of our electricity in Ontario comes from nuclear, water, solar, and wind. There's a small, as you can see in this chart, the yellow is all electricity. This is rounded. A very small amount of electricity in Ontario comes from burning oil and gas, so that percentage is going back up. So in 2017, while we had cap and trade, 96% of Ontario's electricity was carbon-free, came from nuclear or renewables. But we had 8% the year before. It was cut in half when cap and trade came into effect. In 2018, when we only had cap and trade half the year, guess what? We had 6% again. Fossil fuel emissions came up pretty much exactly what you'd expect. I don't know what's going to be for 2019, and though again the federal carbon tax may make it hard to tell exactly what's having the impact. But that's why we get 63% of our electricity from nuclear, and most of the rest from the various kinds of renewable. And renewable electricity will continue to grow. There's a number of additional projects that are being built and completed. And however, we are still going to have fossil fuel consumption growing if we don't have conservation and given the capacity auction decision that's been made.
Okay, thanks very much, Commissioner. I just note that it's now 12 o'clock. We will stay on a bit longer to take some more questions. If you do have to leave, just a reminder that we will be emailing out the information on the webinar later today. Next question, related to electricity again. Current peak demand is in the summertime. Are there concerns with peak demand shifting to the winter?
So the summer and winter peaks in Ontario are not hugely different, which is why when we have a very cold winter like 2014, we become winter peaking again. And we could become winter peaking again, I suppose, if there was a massive shift of home heating to electricity, and especially if it wasn't done very well. One of the things we recommended last year is looking at a combination. We already have natural gas infrastructure in the majority of places where people live in Ontario, and so it makes a lot of sense to use natural gas for peak heating on the very coldest days so that we don't have a huge problem thrown on the electrical system. The other side of that, though, is that we know that the summers are going to get hotter. The summers are going to get hotter because of climate change, and at the same time we have the urban heat island effect getting worse because we are intensifying building concrete in more and more places. And so I think we're going to could see a big increase in energy demand in the summer for cooling. And so it's a bit of a race, which is going to go up more, the winter peak or the summer peak. But in either case, we're going to need to pay a lot of attention to peak reduction. And that's why conservation, storage, and using pricing to have demand follow supply is so important. We also know that there are heat storage options. It doesn't make a lot of sense to just use electricity at peak. Prince Edward Island, for example, was able to put in ceramic electric furnaces that heat up at night when the electricity is surplus and cheap, and then keep the house warm all day. That's a really good option for smoothing out daily peaks. And the technology has been proven. It makes the house very comfortable. We could do that too.
Okay, thanks very much, Commissioner. Next question, will the new funding that's been announced by the federal government, does that offer any opportunities for residential energy efficiency improvements through building envelope upgrades?
Well, I understand this is a good opportunity, that there could be up to $300 million for home retrofits. That's when the other pieces that we talked about would be so important, the awareness piece, the capacity piece, and also dealing with this local improvement charges issue. But yes, having some extra money available for home envelope improvements, that's great news. Let's jump on it. Let's not waste any more renovations.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Next question relates to a specific slide. So just go there now. So the question was that you referenced a data point to support the data in reference to the job numbers here. Just wondering if you could repeat that.
Oh, yeah, so you'll see in the report, what we said was we need to have significant reductions in fossil fuel use in buildings over the next 20 years. So if you think about it, that takes a lot of work starting now. So we estimated that roughly you need about 2% of homes every year to get their building envelopes better for us to have the overall suite of existing houses energy efficient over the next couple of decades. So 2% of homes a year, that would mean doing as many envelope renovations a year as we now build new houses. So the 175,000 jobs that we already have in home renovation in Ontario would have to increase dramatically. That means there would be a lot more jobs or skilled trades. Now exactly which trade and exactly how many jobs, I don't have a final number, but we know it would be a dramatic increase. And we know that there's lots of young people who want jobs in the skilled trades and would like to find work around home. And the great thing about these jobs is this is work that you can't outsource. You can't insulate your building in China. So these are jobs that would definitely be here, and that means people get pay here, which they reinvest in their community, and that's one of the reasons that we know, we've seen this in the US, states that have better energy efficiency have better local economies because they spend the money locally instead of spending it on imported fossil fuels, and that money circulates in the local economy, and then the person who, as you see, is installing the window, they then go to the grocery store and they buy stuff locally.
Yeah, thanks very much, Commissioner. Just wanted to point out, in addition to the questions, we've also got a large number of comments thanking both you and the office for our service and our work. So thanks very much to people for those comments.
We really, really, really appreciate that.
Next question, with the government's cancellation of electricity conservation, does that create an opportunity to recreate a single delivery agent for all utility programs so that building owners would only have a single point of contact?
So the government hasn't yet canceled all electricity conservation. What they've done is they have canceled the electricity conservation framework, which was supposed to be a 6-year framework. Again, makes it so difficult to make any kind of long-term planning in Ontario if you can't count on a 6-year government framework to last the 6 years. But, and they have slashed the money available for energy conservation, but the remaining money is being managed by the independent electrical system operator in a centralized fashion instead of being managed locally. There's a lot of disadvantages to that. One of the advantages is there's now one big gas company and there is one big independent electrical system operator, and so it's conceivable that they could cooperate and have a joint delivery function, exactly because, especially big building owners, big real estate managers who manage, like our landlord here who manages 25 million square feet, they'd like to have one point of contact. And that could happen. There's no guarantee that it will. And that's another reason why planning for 2020, post-2020 needs to start now. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to build a whole new point of contact if it's going to be torn up next year. But if we could have some consistency and from the government and some commitment to a long-term structure, then it would be very sensible for the ISO and the gas company together to have a single point of contact, and hopefully it could deal with water conservation as well and help willing building owners and operators to do this. Many of them are willing. I've heard this from a number of different parts of the industry. They want to do this, but they need single, consistent direction from the government and hopefully some financial assistance.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. In addition to conservation, our next question asks, can you say something about air source heat pumps? Where do you see those fitting in along with other alternatives to fossil fuels as a measure for home heating?
Well, air source heat pumps have got a lot better. They're not as efficient as ground source heat pumps, but they're much cheaper to install, especially in existing buildings. So they have tremendous potential because they wouldn't I wouldn't want to size them, as I said, for peak heating, but you don't need to, because most of these buildings already have natural gas infrastructure. You can keep the natural gas infrastructure for those really bitter minus 20 days and use a air source heat pump to provide base level heating through most of the year, and it can also provide cooling on those extremely hot days that we're going to have more and more of. So I think it will, again, make homes more comfortable. Ideally, you want to improve the efficiency of the building before you size your heat pump, because otherwise you're going to be spending much more on your heat pump than you need. But if you can make your envelope more efficient and then put in a small heat pump, well, then you get cooling when you really need it. You get most of your year's heating very inexpensively, and you can then use your natural gas system only for really, really cold days.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Next question relates to conservation programs for low-income customers. Do you think the current programs are successful in meeting the needs of vulnerable consumers? And what, if anything, could be improved with them?
So those programs, when they are available, are really helpful. We have some case studies in our report, for example, specifically on certain of the First Nations reserves. And I've had the privilege of standing in some of the homes on those First Nations reserves, and it is truly appalling and disgusting, the condition of many of those houses. I mean, you talk about leaks. One of the ones I was in didn't have any intact interior walls, didn't even have a doorknob. So they had a sock in the hole. So these houses, they're terribly expensive to try to keep warm. They're terribly uncomfortable to live in. And what we have seen is when these low-income programs are available, they go in, they improve these houses, they make them half decent in terms of their energy efficiency. They cost much less to heat, and they're much more pleasant to live in. People can have a more dignified life in these houses. So that's great when it happens. And I was very glad to see that those programs were not canceled last week by the government, because they really are needed. However, there's not nearly enough money. There's a huge demand for improvement of these buildings. You think about the social housing buildings in Ontario. We reported on that last year. One of the big things that cap and trade money was doing was dramatically improving the energy efficiency of social housing, and all of that's been slashed. So the biggest issue is we have a tiny amount of money. What it's doing is good, but it's a pittance in comparison with the need.
Thanks, Commissioner. Next question comes from a climate advocacy group in Kingston. They ask, how can we be most effective in spurring real climate action at the municipal level and the community level, given the current provincial situation and the federal uncertainty?
Right. That's a great question. I was delighted to see Kingston declaring a climate emergency. I do think that this is the time when municipal leadership is incredibly important. We're not going to get it from the provincial government. I don't know what we're going to get federally after the election. So municipal government is the closest to people. It owns most of the infrastructure. It is the easiest to influence. You know your councillor. You might see him or her at the grocery store. You get a chance to go speak to them. So we really need climate leadership from municipalities. And one of the advantages is that it's not that anybody knows all the answers, and certainly the provincial governments don't. So municipalities have the opportunity to experiment, to try things out, to do pilot projects, to work with local communities to see what works best. We saw with the Clean Water Act that local initiatives that were based on particular local needs and trade-offs worked really well across Ontario, and maybe we're going to start seeing that on climate. We all have a stake in climate. Individual action is important, but collective action is essential. And municipalities can't do everything, but they can do an enormous amount and much more than they have been. And let's start with municipal operations have a big footprint. They're important in terms of setting a leadership, and municipalities have, not the whole decision on land use, but they have a huge role on land use. And as I've just shown you, land use is our most dominant problem. So municipalities can absolutely do a huge amount. Thank you for your work in Kingston. Keep at it.
Thanks, Commissioner. Our next question, more of a general question, but perhaps ties into some of the comments you had on the difference between energy intensity and overall energy use near the beginning of the presentation. So the question is that overconsumption is one of the major drivers behind climate change and species extinction. And how can we apply conservation goals to reducing existing overconsumption?
Well, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. Please read the individual consumption paper that we put out yesterday. So there's a very brief overview that's on the blog, and we have a detailed background document. But you're absolutely right that about half, so the bottom line is in terms of individual consumption, which is not the whole story, but is part of it, about half, in terms of an average Ontarian, about half of the carbon footprint comes from just four things: driving, flying, heating your home, and eating beef. The other half, a lot of that comes from consumption of goods and services and overconsumption, buying too much, throwing too much out, and we're not better off by having so much stuff that we then have to look after. At least that's my opinion. So we do have, we've documented that as best we can. It is, I'd also recommend that you look again at our Blue Box, Beyond the Blue Box report on waste, because that's another part of the story. We in Ontario, we are incredibly wasteful. We buy much too much stuff at great expense, and then we throw most of it out again. So we can save a lot more money if we just buy less stuff. The Scottish put it very nicely. I thought we should make things last. Buy good quality things, make them last. Then we've got what we need.
Okay, thanks. Just switch gears for a minute. We have a couple questions related to the future of the eco materials and also your particular future. So questions being, will Ontarians continue to have access to the eco website, the blog? Are there any plans to archive the eco reports? And then a question as to what's next for you personally.
Right. So I can't speak for what the Auditor General will or will not do with our website. I did ask the Auditor General to preserve our website, and current indications are that it's going to survive for at least a while. The Canadian Environmental Law Association will also be putting up all of our reports on their website, and I'll have the URL for that, and I will be publishing that on my LinkedIn website and on my LinkedIn page and on Twitter. And then next week, as I said, I'm going to start a new little business, The Dog and Me, called Sacks Facts, FACTS, and I'll have a website soon, I hope. And I'll also put the URL up there so that people will have links to our reports. We've also got thumb drives that have copies of all the reports. Oh yes, my Twitter handle is at EnviroLaw1, ENVIROLAW1. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you're interested in keeping up to date with my work, and Google me at the end of next week when hopefully I will have a more or less working website. We weren't sure, as you know, whether we were going to have till the end of April for the ECO, and I've got a whole batch of speaking invitations in April, including 4 next week, so I'm not sure how much I'll get done on the website. But I promise I will continue to be available. I'll be continuing to be interested in receiving information and in providing information because we're all in this together. And like some of you, I have children and grandchildren, and so I really care about what the future is going to look like, and we have this very small window left to make a difference in what's coming, and what Ontario does really matters. So I'm going to continue to do my part. I hope all of you will. I know that my staff will go on to do the best they can wherever they are, and I hope you will. But you know what? It wouldn't hurt. Go ahead and download the stuff now.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Next question goes back to the energy use of cars. The provincial government's 10-cent gas tax reduction won't encourage energy conservation. Can road and parking pricing be used to fill that gap from both a congestion reduction and a revenue point of view?
Absolutely can and should, and again is based on good evidence. We've documented that in substantial detail in our climate report last year. I think it was in what's now, it could have been in the report before that. But one of the last 2 climate reports, absolutely, we looked at road pricing, how important and effective it is. It was the Chapter 7, which was on freight, but I don't remember anymore which report it was on. Climate action report? Okay. Anyway, yes, so we did look at that in some detail, and absolutely, road pricing is an essential tool if we want to reduce the number of kilometers driven. One of the things we showed in that report is that, yes, there have been some improvements in efficiency of vehicles and some slight improvement in the renewable content of fuels. But the benefit of those has been blown away by the enormous increase in the number of kilometers driven. And the road pricing is one of the few tools that really works to reduce that.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Next question, going back to energy conservation programs. Do you see any negative repercussions from the proposal to shift the funding of conservation programs away from utility customers and back to the tax base?
Yes. There's a number of huge problems with it. First problem is we already have a gigantic deficit in Ontario, although there's a lot of dispute about how big that deficit really is. There's no question that it's big. And the government has told us many times that we're all going to have to make many sacrifices and that they're going to be moving towards a balanced budget. And that suggests that the taxpayers are not likely going to be a reliable source of funding for conservation, and we already know how much priority the government puts on conservation. The fact is that the taxpayers are now paying $2.5 billion a year to subsidize electricity pricing, which again positively works against conservation. So yes, it suggests to me that there isn't in fact going to be any significant amount of money for conservation available after 2020, and we've already shown why that's a bad idea.
Okay, thanks. Next question relates to the municipal role in energy conservation. In regard to housing in the context of energy conservation, what's the single most important policy that you think a municipality could implement?
Well, the single most important is land use planning, absolutely. What is going to get built? We already have a lot of the wrong things built. We shouldn't be building more of the wrong things. We definitely need significant increases of density in existing urban areas. One of the another interesting fact that I learned from the research done for Chapter 4 was how many of the suburbs, particularly the older suburbs, are losing population. So if you think about Scarborough, for example, it was designed at a time when the expectation was that the average family would have 4 kids. So there'd be 6 people living in each house. That's not the situation now. And so what that means is there are now far fewer people to support, for example, a local store. There's far fewer people to support local transit. There's far fewer people to support a local school. So those areas are losing vitality, or at best stagnating. And to get that vitality back, to get enough economic demand to support stores and cafes and laundries and libraries and the other kinds of services people would like to be able to walk to, they need more people. They need to at least get back to what they were designed for. And we're not going to have families with 4 kids again. At least I wouldn't expect so. So we need to think about ways to provide creative infill. And there's lots of evidence on how to do that. San Francisco, for example, has a similar kind of problem, really high housing prices. And they want to keep, well, they've got a limited land area. So how can you add infill housing sensitively in a way that improves the community for everybody who's already there, as well as providing room for a lot more people? And so they've done a lot of work on how you add another floor, or you add another piece behind, or you have an L-shaped addition, or you have laneway housing, or you've got granny suites. And we do know that there's a lot of ways to do that. By and large, we in the Greater Toronto area are not doing that would allow us to create reasonably priced housing in places where people want to live that also provide support for local services, local jobs, local cafes, so that, your kid or your uncle could open a little business and have enough people there to make a go out of it.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Just a note, we're going to try to wrap up in about 10 minutes or so. We've got our last few questions queued up. If you still have questions, you can please submit them to us via email. Next question, since delivery costs are the major cost for homeowners, shouldn't we be moving to supplying solar energy to meet our electricity needs with a solar panel on our roof?
So, of course, it depends whether you're talking about electricity or heating. For many people, it makes sense to have a solar panel on their roof, and will make even more sense as solar panels get cheaper. And if Mr. Munkett gets his roofing tiles that are also solar panels working, and that might be even better for at least some of your supply. We do have a detailed discussion of net metering in the electricity report that I mentioned, making connections from last year, which I do really hope you will look at. There are lots of people live in places where they can't use solar effectively, either because their house is oriented east-west instead of north-south, or because of trees, or because of other kinds of shading. There's also the fact that we need electricity not just when the sun is shining, so you either need to have storage or you have to treat the grid as storage, which has other kinds of costs. So there definitely is a role for a lot more distributed solar. And I think we will see that continue to happen. The Chinese, among other people, are continuing to drive down the cost of solar. And so we'll probably see more of that, but that creates real challenges for utilities as to, it changes their supply model, their pricing model, and there's going to have to be some cooperative work on how do we make that really work. And that's part of why the silo problem is so serious. If the electricity system is left to cope with this alone, it's going to have a lot of difficulty.
Okay, thanks. I think I'll build on that question with another somewhat related question. Do we currently have any infrastructure in Ontario for energy storage?
So when you see energy storage, I think you're probably talking mostly about electricity storage. In terms of natural gas storage, we do. We have big caverns that store natural gas, and certain amount of petroleum products are in tanks. For electricity storage, we have some things. So first of all, we have pump storage is the most well-established and cheapest method of storing electricity around the world, and we have a big facility in Niagara for that. And we also have enormous capacity for additional pump storage in Ontario, one at Marmora and one at Little Notch, both of which we reported on in our electricity report. In terms of other forms of storage, we have compressed air storage, hydro storage is doing. There is some battery storage. We have a tentative hydrogen storage facilities using electricity to make hydrogen, and then using that to either feed into the grid or go back into the electricity system as an experiment. There is more and more use of batteries, particularly by large private customers, so they don't have to buy power during peak hours. So the bottom line is we have a growing amount of storage. We need more. We have the capacity for large pump storage, as I say, particularly at Marmora is a big possible option. And there is, as batteries continue to improve, there's more opportunities for distributed electricity storage. There's also the opportunity to store heat instead of electricity, which I already mentioned, the ceramic furnaces. And I don't know if I mentioned actually the Windsor Casino. So they have ice storage. They use electricity when it's cheap at night to make ice. And then when they need to cool their casino on a hot afternoon, they run the air over the ice. It's much cheaper to store ice than it is to store electricity. So in many cases, when what we need is heat, it makes more sense to store or cool. It makes sense to store the heat or cool instead of storing electricity. And again, that's an area where I'm glad to see more innovation happening.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Next question kind of related to our procurement and our buying choices. Different materials purchased, used, and wasted have different carbon footprints. What would it take to get the carbon or energy use, et cetera, for each item mandated, similar to what we see with calorie counts for food, so that this could be incorporated into procurement choices?
Right.
And there's a comment there that this question could also be on procurement and materials purchase, could be a place where the Ontario Environment Plan and the government could be a leader.
Right. Well, thank you for those questions. So we wrote extensively on exactly this, on procurement and on disclosure of the carbon footprint of materials in our climate report. I think it was in From Plan to Progress. There's a specific chapter on procurement, and we know that the government took it very seriously and that there are some pilot projects going on right now for the government to figure out the carbon footprint of construction materials for infrastructure projects. So thank you for that question. We did detailed work on that, and I commend you to please look at the previous climate reports. They're chock full of really useful information, and most of it is still current.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Next question, sort of on the ease of building energy efficiency into new homes versus existing homes. Question being, I have the impression it's cheaper to build new than to try to retrofit when we're seeking energy efficiency in detached homes. Do you have any thoughts on sort of the comparison or the costs of those two approaches, given that also that a new build typically has a bigger footprint because you're adding a lot of new materials?
So that's a really good question. The fact is, though, that we're not normally choosing between building new and renovating the old houses. As we show in Chapter 3, most of the houses, almost all the houses we have now were built a long time ago, and most of those houses are still going to be around in a decade or two. We don't turn over houses that often. So new houses have to be better, and new houses do get, the building code helps with that. Though I was very sorry to see that one of the conservation programs that was canned last week was a program to help encourage people to build even better than building code when they're building new. We have to deal with renovating the existing houses because we already have them and we're going to keep having them. In terms of the carbon footprint of building materials, you're absolutely right that there is a big carbon footprint to building materials, again, depending on how you build. So one of the things that, again, we reported on earlier is the tremendous advantage of building with wood instead of concrete. From a carbon point of view, and also in terms of keeping money in Ontario, we have the capacity to produce a lot of wood in Ontario, and we're suffering more from lack of markets for that wood than lack of supply. We've got lots of supply. So the carbon footprint of a new build can be affected quite a lot by which materials you choose and how you source those materials, and wood is a great option.
Thanks, Commissioner. Next question, going back to the changes around electricity conservation. Do you see a new way forward for the local utilities to participate in conservation given the cancellation of the existing framework, whether that might be energy efficiency bidding into the capacity auction you mentioned or something else?
Well, I hope so. The local distribution company conservation staff in many cases are really impressive people. I've been very honored to meet some of them as I've gone around Ontario, and I've been very pleased with their commitment and their initiative and their tremendous knowledge of their local market and community and how much they've been able to achieve, and also the relationships that they have built over years with their colleagues and their customers. And a lot of what gets done in business and in the world depends on those relationships, and I think it's a terrible shame for the government to throw those away. So I do hope that they are able to find new ways to use that. Bidding into the capacity auction, I don't know if that's going to be allowed, but it makes a lot of sense to me that conservation should be able to bid into the capacity auction, and in fact everything possible should be done to facilitate that and make it possible. I do hope that we'll also see a role for them in providing their expertise to building owners who, whether or not they get funding for energy improvements, often still would like to have their bills go down. One thing that it will take a little while to happen, but electricity prices are artificially low at the moment because, as I already mentioned, taxpayers are paying $2.5 billion in subsidies every year, which increases the deficit, to subsidize electricity rates. Those subsidies are going to run out. Under the current legislation, they start running out in 2021. I don't know what the current government is planning, but they will run out and electricity rates are going to go back up because the electricity system costs $21 billion a year to run, and that's not going to go down, at least not significantly. So electricity rates will go up. That means there will be again, a stronger incentive to conserve at least electricity, and that might be an opportunity to stimulate private interest in, okay, how do we get more efficient? We might also see, I've seen, since I became commissioner, and I think we've helped contribute to this, I've seen a real upsurge in public awareness of the urgency of climate change. And as disasters continue to pile up, I think that awareness will increase, and that in turn may lead to building owners and operators' interest in reducing their carbon footprint, at least so they can look their kids in the face when they go home. So there again may be a source of some market for the extraordinary expertise that the local conservation staff have built up. At least I hope so.
Yeah, thanks. We've got 3 questions left before we wrap up. Next question, what about importing hydroelectricity from Quebec to replace our nuclear power?
So I'm sorry to sound a bit like a broken record, but we did write about this in the electricity report last year. I'm glad that the electricity report continues to be so close to people's interests. The short answer is that right now, given the electricity transmission lines that we have, there is only a very small capacity to import more power from Quebec than we already do. The Hydro One is spending a little bit of money to improve the transmission line, to remove some artificial bottlenecks on that line, but that doesn't increase the total capacity very much. We don't have the capacity with existing transmission lines to bring in enough to replace, for example, the Pickering plants. But we could import more if we built new big transmission lines. What I have to caution people is that big infrastructure projects like major transmission lines, they take a long time to build. One of the very first projects I started working on in the Ontario government in 1970, gosh, what year that was, 75 maybe, was a transmission line from the Bruce nuclear plant down to ESSA. And I think it took 30 years to get that built. So I wouldn't count on there being a new transmission line right away.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Next question, why doesn't Ontario have a net zero energy building code in place by now?
Well, I mean, first of all, I really can't answer why questions. Our job is to answer what questions. We can tell you factually what the situation is. I personally have not seen any indication that energy conservation and climate issues are particularly important to this government. But I guess you better ask them. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Our last question for today. Do you have any idea what's happening with the $500 million that was unspent, collected through the cap and trade process, but not spent?
Well, we asked for that information from the government, but they wouldn't give it to us. So we don't know. Keep watching. Eventually, they'll have to report. I hope they tell us in some reasonable detail. I would have reviewed the report on that, but now, of course, we're not able to do so. Perhaps the Auditor General will. Listen, thank you very much, everybody, for the excellent questions and for your attention and for your passion and interest in these issues. I know that many of you work on these issues just as hard as we do and care about them as much as we do. So thank you for your work. Look at our electricity report. It's got a lot of the questions you asked us. And please also, if you do have the opportunity to tell other people about our reports, please do. Please let them know the information is there. I've been doing a lot of work over the years to bring these reports to people's attention. We're now going to need other people to help with that. So we hope we can count on you. Thank you so much, everybody, and best wishes.